Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to address the annual conference of the INSS. Your institute has a reputation that goes well beyond Israel, beyond the region. Its work on issues related to peace in the Middle East, to energy independence, to cybersecurity is valued around the world, and I want to thank you and congratulate you for your excellent work in the past and wish you every success as well for the future. When I was preparing to come to speak to this event, I was considering actually talking about the opportunities and the threats that the giant tectonic geopolitical shifts in the Middle East present for Israel 70 years after the establishment of the modern Israeli state. 70 years in which you have crafted a modern democracy, one that is governed by the rule of law, protected by an independent judiciary, a vibrant civil society, and very often, if not always, an unforgiving free media. Israel is a state at the cutting edge of technology, both in civil and military progress. Your defense forces are capable of presenting a formidable threat to anyone who challenges the sovereignty, the independence of the very existence of the State of Israel. All of these achievements are fantastic, and you ought to be proud for 70 years. But it's been 70 years in which Israel has survived in a hostile environment. From day one until today, every single day, Israel has had to struggle with a number of security challenges that many others would have long given up if they had to face them. Anti-Semitism for all of these 70 years has been alive and continues to be alive today. There are forces that seek the destruction of the State of Israel, and the Middle East today is reeling from a crisis of rising Islamic radicalism. We saw in the emergence and the growth and demise of ISIL how complicated and how terrible this threat is. These are issues that I think define today's discussions, and these are issues that are very much pertinent to anyone who wants to look at the opportunities that are emerging for peace in these troubled times. And perhaps the biggest political question, beyond the daily challenges of Israel's security or politics, is how do we square the circle? How do we make the forces of moderation and modernization in the Middle East cooperate and work with the State of Israel in the interest of peace and security for everyone? Now, these are some of the issues that I wanted to address, but I'm not going to be talking about them, because I feel that given the developments of the last couple of months, it's perhaps more necessary for me today to talk a little bit more, particularly about the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians in light of where the United Nations stands and in light of recent developments. And I'm not doing this because of any self-serving interest, but because I believe very firmly that any progress that would allow us to create the opportunities that I wanted to discuss today of Arab-Israeli cooperation cannot happen until the question of Palestine is resolved. And the real benefits of such cooperation cannot be reaped until there is progress in resolving the Palestinian issue. And I say progress intentionally because I think we face today a very important challenge. Do we continue collectively to manage the Israeli-Palestinian process, or do we seek to resolve it? If we seek to manage it, the options are quite open, are quite clear. We need to talk about security, we'll need to talk about Gaza, and we'll need to talk about the West Bank, but we will be limited in talking about the vast benefits that will open to the Middle East if the conflict is resolved. And I also happen to be the only person in the United Nations whose business card says Middle East peace process. So actually, I do have a self-serving interest in talking about these issues. And when we talk about the Middle East peace process, the two questions that I get most often when I hand my business card is, oh, you're dealing with the whole Middle East, and I have to explain that no, I'm not. I'm dealing with Israel and the Palestinians. And when I say that, people look at me and say, well, there is no peace process then, is there? So there's a big sense of pessimism today regarding the peace process, a sense that really the international consensus on key questions related to the two-state solution as being the only feasible option for resolving the conflict are being challenged. The basic premises of what has long been accepted as the international parameters regarding final status issues is being challenged. I think there's hardly a day, not just in Israeli media, in American media as well, in Europe, that you don't see an op-ed or a commentary declaring the end of the peace process, the end of the two-state solution, or both. So those dealing with the peace process as a way towards resolving the conflict today face a very serious sense of pessimism. But it seems to me that also those who are dealing with managing the conflict also have a foreboding feeling about how long this process of managing the conflict can continue. And to both camps, this time is a perfect opportunity for us to rethink what we're doing and to consider how we can regain a sense of direction. A sense of direction is very important because we need to reassess many of the paradigms that have governed this process in the past and look at anchoring our thoughts and our ideas into the reality of the political landscape of today. So let me start with this. I don't believe the peace process is dead. And I don't believe that the prospect for peace either is dead. Of course, we're at a critical crossroad, and we've been at that crossroad many times in the past as well. I have to address the Security Council once a month, and often myself and my team struggle because every time we start drafting the speech, we have to say that the situation is unsustainable and that the trust between Israelis and Palestinians has come down to its lowest points. And every time we have to figure out new synonyms to say pretty much the same thing, because that is the general understanding of what we are. But if we delve a little bit further than the words, and you know far better than I do, that in the past the level of trust between Israelis and Palestinians has fallen to even lower points than it is today. That the level of violence has reached in the past unacceptable peaks. Today, the level of violence is perhaps at its lowest. Neither party today, or up to this day, has withdrawn from the agreements of the past officially. Key institutions created by the Oslo process are still in place. So these are some basic caveats of why I really believe that we still have a chance at peace. And the Secretary General of the United Nations has become famous for always saying the same thing related to the two-state solution. There is no plan B. And for us in the United Nations, there is no plan B because we really believe that the two-state solution is the core of any possible agreement to the future. This is not a dogma, this is not a whim, this is not a position that comes out of nowhere. It comes out of a very serious assessment of where we stand. Firstly, both parties have in all of their past rounds of negotiation discussed their agreements, their future agreements on that premise. And this goes from prime minister to prime minister in the past, and this has been the case for quite some time now. If you look at the polls of public opinion among Palestinians and Israelis, the largest number of people still believe that Israelis and Palestinians need to separate. They need to live in states of their own, yes, with security and economic and other arrangements that work for both sides, but that each side needs to be the master of its own fate. Of course, if you look at the polls again, you will see that less and less people believe that this solution is feasible or realistic at this stage. But the belief that this is the basis of any future peace is still there. The two-state outcome is supported by the international community. It is enshrined in UN Security Council resolutions. In fact, it goes back to the original resolution on partition in 1948. So we can't walk away from it that quickly and that easily. And I believe it is also key to resolving the Israeli-Arab conflict, because it is very important that we understand that if we want to reach and reap the benefits of Arab-Israeli cooperation, we need to have an agreed list of parameters on the basis on which we seek peace. And the two-state outcome is perhaps the key aspect of that. But there's one other reason that I feel very emotional about personally, and I think it's perhaps the most overarching, politically important reason for everyone. And that is that no other formula that is being floated out there addresses the legitimate national, historic aspirations of both peoples, of Jews, the Jewish people, to live in a home of their own in the state of Israel, and of the Palestinians to live in a state of their own here. No other formula allows for both sides to preserve and to develop the national dignity, the freedom that they want to have, and to work out the security of how they interact and how they work together in their ancestral homelands as masters of their own fate. Every other option, except two states, except separating Israelis and Palestinians on the basis of two states, does not address these goals. And as somebody who comes from the Balkans, Bulgaria, a country that regained its independence 140 years ago after having been erased off the map for about 500 years ago, a country that is surrounded by complicated neighbors with whom we fought so many wars, and hundreds of thousands of people have died, including in two world conflicts. I can personally attest to how important national aspirations are. And outside of the table of negotiations, of the parameters and of the speeches and the Security Council resolutions and of the laws, it is important to actually look at what people as nations want. And I don't believe that the Jewish people, that Israelis, want to live in a state in which one part of the state governs the other part of the state, in which some are disenfranchised and others have full rights, because that undermines democracy, that undermines the goals to which this state was created to achieve. But from today's perspective, we need to ask ourselves more practically, how can a two-state solution be achieved? And it cannot be achieved through violence and conflict. It can be achieved through negotiations. And certainly these are negotiations that are bilateral between the two sides, because it is Israelis and Palestinians that ultimately will have to live with each other and who live with each other. And they're the only ones who can decide what is on the table and what is off the table. They're the only ones who can actually reach compromises that are important, because they are the ones that will be taking the risks of these compromises. However, where we are today, there is a propensity on both sides for unilateral action. Unilateral action that undermines this prospect and that certainly aims to prejudge any final status negotiations. And this is a dangerous place to be in, because today, objectively, neither the Israeli nor the Palestinian side is in a position to sit down and have meaningful negotiations on the final status issues, for all kinds of reasons, and each side has its own reasons. As someone recently said, the maximum of what each side is willing to offer doesn't meet the minimum of the other's ability to negotiate. And in this environment, however, what we need to do as the international community, as the United Nations and our partners in the Quartet, we need to look at how to create the conditions that will ultimately be conducive to the return of both sides to the table in the future. And to do that, we need to look at what are the negative trends that are happening on the ground. Last year, the Middle East Quartet published, I think it was about a 7-page report called the Quartet Report. It was the first time that we actually together did something like that. I encourage everyone to take a look at it, because I think that report very clearly outlines what are the negative trends that are happening on the ground. And these include, surprise, surprise, violence and terror. incitement. But it also includes the continued construction and building of settlements in the West Bank, the limits that have been imposed and continue to be imposed on Palestinian development, the demolition of Palestinian structures. Of course, it includes the situation in Gaza and the fact that for the last decade, the legitimate Palestinian government has not been in control of Gaza. It has been under control and continues to be under the control of Hamas, which has not halted in its militant buildup and its construction of rockets and tunnels and planning and execution of terror attacks against Israelis. Now, these are trends that need to be addressed if we are to actually create an environment that is conducive. Of course, one can say we need confidence-building measures, but confidence-building measures will not be enough. What we actually need, ladies and gentlemen, are affirmative and transformative steps that both parties will take to strengthen the chances of the Palestinian economy to address its infrastructure and basic services, to strengthen its service delivery to people so that people feel the benefits of that, to enhance the powers and responsibilities of the PA and to create new sources of revenue. This is in the interest of Israel, this is in the interest of the Palestinians, and it is in the interest of peace. It preserves the prospect of a two-state solution for the future, and it provides the only way forward for us to address the question of are we managing or are we seeking to resolve this conflict. Interestingly enough, in the next few weeks, I hope, as the media and everyone continues to talk about the demise of Oslo, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators are sitting at the table on specific issues like electricity and water and 3G and telecommunications, and actually reaching agreements on financial and economic issues that are of importance. And perhaps continuing down that road and strengthening those initiatives and making sure that they are connected and that they are parts of the building blocks of the future Palestinian state is important as we move forward. Tomorrow, the donors will convene in Brussels along with Israeli and Palestinian representatives to talk about, in the format which we call the AHOC, to talk about, usually this format talks about institutional support to the Palestinian Authority. I hope that tomorrow, as we convene at a high level with a number of Arab foreign ministers in attendance as well, that we are able to pass a very clear message on three things. Firstly, that is that the two-state solution is still the core of the international consensus of how to resolve this conflict. Secondly, that we need to work with the Palestinian Authority and we need to support their plan and help them develop a plan of how they're going to return to Gaza. Because without that, Gaza risks exploding in our face again, this time in a far more violent and deadly manner than in the past. And thirdly, that we continue to work with the PA, not to give up on the institutions that they have built, and particularly on the provision of services to their own people, because that is critical for the future. Returning Gaza under the legitimate Palestinian control and ending all the militant activity there is critical. It is critical to Israel's security, it is critical to Egypt's security, it is critical for the people of Gaza and for the Palestinians in general. As someone who goes to Gaza quite often, I can tell you that I often say publicly in Security Council briefings and other formats that we're in the midst of a major humanitarian crisis. Well, let me be very clear today here that we're well beyond that. We're on the verge of a total systems failure in Gaza, with the full collapse of the economy, the social services, political, humanitarian, and security implications stemming from that. And I believe that as we meet tomorrow in Brussels, one of our key messages must really be on what can we actually do to create and preserve hope for the people of Gaza in order to address both the militant aspect of it and the humanitarian aspect of it. And this is critical if we are to have any success and also addressing what to many Israelis and to a number of families in Israel is very personal and very emotional, and that is receiving information about the family members who have been lost in Gaza and who are believed to be there, and the bodies of those soldiers who have not been returned. Ladies and gentlemen, the two-state solution is a prerequisite for peace, and it requires negotiations, and the resumption of meaningful negotiations requires conditions. And what I say today is that we need to focus on what are these conditions and to work on them. And let me leave you in closing with two thoughts of two things that we don't often talk about. We in the United Nations, the international community, but also the public debate. Firstly, it is the question that it is not enough to improve physical infrastructure, economic, or even security conditions for people. We need to look at not just what is happening on the ground. We need to look at the toxic atmosphere that is above ground. In social media and in broader public discourse, blind hatred and dehumanization are setting the tone. They're fueled by irresponsible rhetoric, which when silently political, spiritual, and community leaders look the other way. I believe that it is time for us to be very clear, and tomorrow the Secretary General will be absolutely clear in the UN General Assembly when he speaks about anti-Semitism, that we have to show zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, for racism, for xenophobia, and for anti-Muslim hatred. Not just in Europe, not just here in Israel, but around the world, and particularly also in the Middle East. And finally, we need to adapt to the historic changes that are taking place in the region. It is no longer enough to have a silo approach on how we deal with the various conflicts and problems in the Middle East. We need to have a much more holistic approach, because the enemies of peace in the region understand that very well, and they're far better than us collectively in connecting the dots of all the conflicts around us. We need to connect those dots in the interest of peace and in the interest of security for both Israelis and Palestinians, for Arabs and Jews alike, and in the interest of peace in this region and most broadly around the world. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today.